Father Tony. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Al. Back again. The journey continues, finding out more and more about our beloved saint.
Right.
And this week we're talking about Saint Teresa of Avila,
Right.
another mystic, one of 4 women doctors in the church,
Right.
and one who, like we talked a little bit about in the last episode with Vincent de Paul, that he had a kind of a female partner, spiritual partner of Louise de Marillac, who would helped him to fulfill his mission and ministry. Same thing we have now with Teresa of Avila, who had John
of the
Cross and everything. But let's find out more about this doctor of the church.
Yeah, Teresa of Avila was a rabble-rouser. There's no way else to put it. She just was. She was really ahead of her time in a lot of ways. She was born in the 16th century. Her whole life was in the 16th century, in the 1500s. And what's going on at that time is the Reformation.
To put into context.
Correct. The context of what's going on is there's this call for reform that was headed by Martin Luther and then others, of course. And as a response, when we look back at those decades of the 1500s after Luther's revolt, it's really interesting to see how the church, the Catholic Church, responded. And there are a lot of ways, but the 3 that people know the most are the formation of the Jesuit order, a missionary education, strong education order that took the word of Catholicism around the world, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. The Council of Trent, of course, 1545 to 1563, which is going to really reaffirm Catholic teachings and codify things. But then the third wing of that, if you will, the third arm of the Catholic Reformation was the reforming of the monastic orders throughout Europe. And it was started really by Teresa of Avila.
And John of the Cross.
And John of the Cross. Like you said before so well, it's amazing how many of these saints are spiritual partners with each other. And we could tick off several of them. Like you said, we talked about some last time with Louise de Marillac and Vincent de Paul. Claire and Francis, come to mind.
Francis de Sales, Jane de Chantal.
De Chantal, right. And they're spiritual friends who really help each other's ministry through their prayer, through their encouragement. And I think there's a strong lesson there for us. But Teresa was born. She lived a life that was somewhat of a wastrel. She was frivolous. She had a later life vocation. Now at that time, she became a nun or entered the convent when she was 21. So that's not young. That's young to us today. But it wasn't at that time.
And she did come from wealth this time.
Yes.
She did because her dad was a wool merchant.
Yeah, you're right. She did come from wealth. And when she entered the Carmelite convent, I think she was horrified by a lot of what she saw. So this is something else to put into context.
Yes.
What was happening was there was a lot of need for reform in the monastic tradition, specifically for women. And what we were seeing is, now you know what a dowry is, of course.
Of course.
Women's families would save money, and when they would get married, the dowry would go to the husband's family.
Correct.
And to him. And if you were a father that had a daughter that entered the convent, that dowry oftentimes went to the convent.
Exactly.
Depending on the amount of dowry would really determine a lot of the perks you got. You'd get to wear cosmetics and jewelry. You wouldn't have to wear the habit. You'd have different prayer responsibilities. Different quarters. Your cells were different.
Different food.
You could even have gentlemen callers.
Well, and they had quite a few visitors that came in, and they were supposed to be cloistered, and all these people kept coming in and visiting, and they felt that was corrupting the environment.
It's said that Teresa was at the convent and she saw a statue of Jesus after he had been scourged at the pillar. And he looked just terribly, as you can imagine. Just his skin was ripped, it was bloody, and it just drove her to her knees. And she said, this is not how we should be living. And so she committed herself to a life of simplicity and humility and austerity and prayer. And so she wanted to start her own religious order. And it was an offshoot of the Carmelites. She ended up calling them the Discalced
Carmelites. And we know them because of Holy Hill.
Correct.
That's the religious order that operates and runs Holy Hill.
That's right. The word discalced means without shoes. They did not walk around barefoot. It was a mentality that said,
heart set.
Exactly, we are going to have this mission, this mindset of simplicity, of humility. And so Discalced Carmelites come from that. Now this, as you can imagine, I just described this situation where people had all these creature comforts.
Well, this didn't sit well with them. She was asking them to give all that up, and they rebelled.
Correct.
To the point.
Twice we know that there were attempts on her life to kill her because they were so comfortable in their surroundings, and they didn't want to give them up. So it tells you something about how she really pushed the envelope. But we could talk a little bit more about that later, I suppose. But just to get back to what she was like, she was a joyful person. She was full of life, and she was somebody who had a great relationship with Jesus. I would say a friendship with Jesus. There's a great story, and I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but it's a great story. Dorothy Day writes about it in her own autobiography.
Oh, really?
She was so inspired by the story that Teresa was traveling, and she was bounced out of a cart that she was traveling in, and she fell. And as she was rubbing her backside in pain, she looked up to heaven and said, this is not how this is terrible. I'm doing all this missionary work. And the response from heaven was, this is how I treat my friends. And she said, and that's why you have so few of them.
Oh, no.
And it gives you this insight of, wow, I wouldn't have the gumption to say that if I heard a voice from heaven. But anyway, she was somebody who was very real about her spirituality, and it's going to affect later her whole ministry, because she is what we called, you said before, a mystic. She's going to have major mystical experiences.
And some of those visions, I saw some of the pictures that you have, and she was being pierced
in
the heart.
Right. In her autobiography, it's called the VII, or the Life, she talks about one of the major mystical experiences she had was an angel piercing her heart with a sword, or with an arrow.
Yeah.
And it was her way of describing her deep, intense love.
They called it. They call those ecstasy
events. And so this is a person who has. How do you describe the undescribable to someone who'll never understand? I always have this. This is the analogy. My wife, my wife Katie, and I, of course, have 3 children. Mm-hmm. I'm never going to give birth.
And 1 grandchild.
And 1 grandchild. Now, yes, I'm never going to give birth, but I can ask Katie.
What was it like?
What was it like? How did it feel? And how is she going to be able to describe to me something I'm never going to be able to describe, other than analogy, metaphor, things I have described? Sure. So she can tell me about the pains or the contractions or what have you in those kind of contexts. So when she writes about this intense experience, she uses this, can I say this, a pseudo-erotic language, because she's saying, how can humans understand the depth of this love? The only thing that comes close would be human love, human married love in the act of sex. And so she uses these very, again, pseudo-erotic terms to describe this intense emotional connection she has with Christ. And just talking about that, one of the greatest pieces of art in Western history is that sculpting of
Bernini.
Bernini sculpted it, and it's called Saint Teresa in Ecstasy.
Yes, the Ecstasy.
And it shows the angel, and her eyes are back, and
and then some people say it was a very erotic image of it, but it's a world-renowned piece of sculpture.
Very famous. And what's interesting is Bernini was smart enough to know that when he depicted her, she has no shoes on because she was descalced. She was without shoes. But it's fascinating to look at the life of a mystic. And how can you ever describe? She was said to levitate at times, and she was embarrassed by it. But she writes about how she would ask her attendants to pull her down to the ground, and they couldn't do it because she was so enraptured in her prayer. But just a remarkable woman, though. A writer, wrote a lot.
Interior Castle, and the Way of Perfection.
The Way of Perfection. The Interior Castle is considered one of the great man or woman.
I've read it.
I did too in college. It's considered one of the great spiritual, mystical works of all time. In any religion, in any male, it doesn't matter when a male, female, doesn't matter. It's really considered a classic. So, Father Tony, what are the personalities, what kind of characteristics do we have from St. Teresa of Avila?
Well, as you said earlier, she was a force to be reckoned with. And as I've said before, she was a mulier fortes, a strong woman, determined. Right. She was described, and I'm going to read this quote because it really sums up a lot about her personality. One papal legate described her as following: as a restless wanderer, disobedient, and stubborn femina, who under the title of devotion invented bad doctrine, moving outside the cloister against the rules of the Council of Trent and her prelates, teaching as a master against St. Paul's orders that women should not teach. Unquote. So how's that? I think she upset the apple cart and with good reason. She was filled with great conviction.
Yeah.
And I think they were born out of her ecstasy events and moments, that intimate relationship that she had with Jesus, and saw the disorder that was in these religious communities, and felt that the need for reform began right in her own community. So she was a rabble-rouser, and together with John of the Cross, they tried to initiate these reforms. So was she beloved? I think in a certain regard she was feared. They wanted to silence her, as you said, that they tried to write her off, you know, and but she was relentless, and she was determined. I brought along. I've been to Avila, an ancient walled city.
Tony.
I know, an ancient walled city in the center of Spain. Beautiful. The walls are still preserved and everything. You can see where she's buried. You can see where she lived, her cell, where she wrote her works. Had mass literally right next door to that room. So those are special moments with many of the people from St. Anthony on the Lake. They were with us as well. And in the courtyard is this statue.
Okay.
And this is a replica. It's not this little tiny one. It's a big,
right.
big statue. But I love this statue, and I brought it home because her foot is moving forward.
Right.
And she has this, and I call it an authority stick. You know what I mean? This cane.
Sure.
That it's that she has the authority of Jesus within
Almost like
her.
a crozier.
Yeah, exactly. And she's stepping forward, and it's a posture of determination and of a calling that she felt that she had to fulfill, and nothing was going to get in the way. So she was determined. She was called. She was disliked by many because of that. But out of that determination came the Discalced Carmelite that we know and love today.
Right.
And so she definitely was a reformer, and did anything she could to make sure that the reform happened.
We talked earlier before we started taping about how that statue is similar to the one of St. Catherine of Siena.
Exactly.
Other
doctor of the church and another reformer.
Another reformer. And that whole idea from the Italian Avanti, the moving forward,
Yeah.
that very forward thrust, their idea of their mission and their ministry is not at all something that's passive.
Yeah, they're not going to cower under the of the pressure and the peer pressure, but they're going to go forth with determination and faith.
Yeah.
So Al, you know, once again, we always ask about signs, symbols affiliated with St. Teresa of Avila.
Well, there's so many. There really are. The first thing I would say is she's always depicted in the garb of the Carmelites, which is a tan and a brown habit, and so we identify her religious order right away. She's oftentimes depicted with a quill and a book, one or both, because she wrote so much, so prolifically, which again is the basis of her being considered or recognized as a doctor of the church. Oftentimes you see her depicted with a dove, which of course represents the Holy Spirit. And she's either looking heavenward toward it, or it's around her head, as if it's there to inspire what she's writing, which I think is just beautiful. That this is not something of earth,
her agenda.
Of her agenda, correct. It's not her axe to grind. This is all inspired by the Holy Spirit, which I think is just a wonderful way to depict her. Some of the other things, it's interesting, you see some icons where she's holding castanets, and it looks like she's dancing, or a tambourine. Because
I've never seen that.
There are several of them. She was known to do that at times. As strict as she
Break
was.
into song.
Exactly right, yes. As you know, as in terms like after the dinner hour or something, when there was a little bit of light time to be, especially on holidays and things of that nature, to recognize that we are joyful people. And so she was somebody who was prone to do that, to remind people, we do have an austere life, a strict life, but there's
room for joy.
Right, always room for joy, and that should be the source of why we do what we do. And so she's depicted oftentimes that way. It's hard for me to imagine her doing that with the castanets and with
because she
the
always
tambourine.
comes off as strong and
Correct.
to be feared and even despised.
But there's a great quote attributed to her that she says, and I'm going to paraphrase it. She says something like, "From sour-faced saints, deliver us, O Lord." You know, she really wanted people to be real. She didn't think you have to be sitting around beating your breast and saying mea culpa all the time. She was somebody who was strict in terms of what she had to do and how we should live our lives, but she always found room for joy. And she said saints should not be examples of people who are, oh, I'm downcast and woe is me, but people who are imbued with that joy of God, of Christ.
I remember years ago when we were doing a campaign for vocations and everything, and under Father Bob Stiefvater, and they asked me for my input and what all that, and I said, we're the billboards.
Yeah.
And if we walk around looking dour
Yes.
and sad and overwhelmed and all those things, who the heck would want to be a priest?
You're exactly right.
And so, yes, she understood that they're the billboard. We should exude the joy and the happiness.
Yeah. Oftentimes she's depicted with, as we talked about before, with the arrow or with angels around her. That, again, references some of the mystical experiences that she had. But those are the major ways that she's shown in iconography that we can see today. So, Father Tony, how can St. Teresa of Avila guide us today?
Oddly enough, I'm thinking of a woman that we both know and love very well, Sister Maria, who lived in the convent. She was a member of the Sisters of Charity at St. Charles Borromeo, where we both worked together for a number of years.
Correct.
Sister Maria oftentimes wrote me wonderful, beautiful letters, and always at the top of the letter, on the upper left-hand side, she wrote the word God alone and an exclamation point. And she started every letter like that. And I always thought, oh, that's so sweet. And I never knew where that came from until I learned more about St. Teresa of Avila and visiting Avila. And it comes from her most famous quote. And I want to read it to you. I have this plaque here in Spanish. This is her handwriting. This isn't her actual handwriting. It's a duplicate, a copy of it, of her most famous quote. I always keep it on the shelf in my library along with this statue of St. Teresa. And this is the quote that is on that plaque that's affiliated with that God alone. She wrote and once said, "Let nothing disturb you, nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God is unchanging. Patience gains all. Nothing is lacking to those who have God. God alone is sufficient." I love that quote.
Could you imagine if everybody lived that, took that to heart, especially what we've been going through the last several years? I mean,
you know, we're an anxious society. And we can oftentimes question, where is God in all of this? And she's telling us right in that quote, God alone is enough.
Right.
That if we really trust and believe that God is with us, that should be sufficient to believe and know that. And from time to time, I think of Sister Maria, and I think of that line, God alone. It's just an absolute surrender to His will. And I think in so many ways, you know, she's also known as Saint Teresa of Jesus.
Right.
You know, and that intimacy and that ecstasy, if you will, moment that she had with Jesus, that says that she could come to that point to write that and live that accordingly, because she faced a lot of turmoil, a lot of opposition, and she could have caved.
Right.
And she could have, instead of having that foot forward, she could have been backing off.
Right.
You know, and but she knew God alone would be all she needed to do what she needed to do to reform and to change lives. She was a woman on mission. And we always think of a man on a mission, but she was a woman on a mission. And it makes me wonder, what is my mission? What is your mission?
Right.
What are any of our missions in life? And people oftentimes talking about, write your own mission statement.
Right.
So say, where are you heading? Where are you going? And do you have the faith that God alone is sufficient in that mission? So I think it's a call for us to get in touch with that mission and our purpose, the purpose-driven life. It's not all about us, but it's all about Him, and to entrust that mission in God alone.
Yeah, that's wonderfully said. It starts with God. It's God that animates it, and it's perfected by God at the end with God. Yeah, that's fantastic.
So very, very true.
Yeah. Father Tony, thanks. This was all great. Love talking about the saints with you so much.
I as well, and I hope that our audience continues to learn and grow in their love for saints as well.
Agreed. And in that vein, it's important to remember that we don't need saints to reach God. God uses saints to reach us.